Hello, I'm John Walter, also known as Gunraven, and this is the introduction to the Yellow King role-playing game by Pelgrane Press. So this video was recorded as a resource for the One Shot Friday Discord server based on a workshop I gave on December 30th, 2022. In this video, I'm going to introduce the Yellow King role-playing game, talk about its inspiration, its themes, and its 4 settings. I'm also going to discuss the basic mechanics for Gumshoe and Quickshot Gumshoe, which is what the game uses. I'm going to provide a brief overview of how to make Yellow King role-playing game characters, using the Paris setting as an example, and I'm going to cover some other basic concepts such as general ability tests and combat in the Quickshot Gumshoe system. So we have here sort of like a little teaser introduction. The book has been written, the book has been read. Now it rewrites you. Across time it spreads, creating dread new realities, and you're in all of them. So what is the Yellow King role-playing game? It's an investigative, weird fiction horror role-playing game. It uses the Quickshot Gumshoe mechanics. It's based on on R.W. Chambers' 1895, The King in Yellow short story collection. That collection, I think there's a series, there's I think like 8 or 9 stories altogether. 4 of them are specifically about the Yellow King, the King in Yellow. Because as it was written by Chambers in 1895, if you're familiar with the King in Yellow from the Cthulhu mythos, this predates the Cthulhu mythos use of the King in Yellow. In fact, this is Chambers' King in Yellow is the inspiration for what becomes the King in Yellow and Hastur in the Cthulhu mythos. But Chambers, because it predates it, Chambers' Yellow King has some significant differences. One major difference in terms of role-playing games is that the Yellow King role-playing game is weird fiction or supernatural horror rather than Lovecraftian cosmic horror. In short, in the Yellow King role-playing game, the player characters can win. So, in a Lovecraftian cosmic horror game, ultimately, the players may be successful. They may sort of forestall the inevitable, the doom that's going to come from the horrific realities of Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos. But in the Yellow King, the players can win. So, the central conceit in the King in Yellow role-playing game is that in 1895 in Paris, a mysterious play titled The King in Yellow was published. The play was rumored to drive its readers mad. The play's creation and publication either causes or was caused by an incursion of alien forces that are rewriting reality. These alien forces include the Yellow King and his court, and they come from a place called Carcosa. Central figures in the play are the stranger, possibly the King in Yellow himself, and the King's daughters, Casilda and Camilla. The players investigate and confront, so in the game, the players can investigate and confront the reality warping incursion from the forces of Carcosa, and the primary antagonists in the game are going to be often the princesses, Casilla and Camilla, the King in Yellow himself, as well as other major figures from the Carcosan court, and then just various supernatural and natural figures that are either allied with or kind of come into being because of the manifestations, the reality warp and incursion from Carcosan forces. So the game has 4 settings. There's the Paris setting, in which the player characters are American art students and friends drawn to the artistic and literary culture of 1895 Belle Epoque Paris. And this is when The King in Yellow is published and when the forces of Carcosa begin to rewrite reality. The second setting is the wars, and that the player characters play French soldiers in a Continental War of 1947. This is part of the alternate timeline. So basically, what we have is the Paris setting is sort of our world where the incursion of Carcosan forces begins, our reality. The wars is part of the alternate reality that's sort of branched off from ours, caused by the incursion. And in that, if you have read any of the King in Yellows, the short story, The Repair of Reputations, you know that around the turn of the century, around 1900, Prussia tried to invade the United States and failed. And because of that, in this alternate reality, there is no World War I, there was no World War II. There is this continental war in Europe of 1947. The GM gets to decide who exactly is involved. However, the player characters are playing French soldiers, and both sides of the war use the weird science and magic that's sort of brought of Carcosan design. So the other two settings, there's Aftermath. That is also set in the alternate reality. So it's set in present day America. The players are former insurgents. The player characters are former insurgents who helped overthrow the Carcosan-backed Castigan regime. The Castigan regime overthrew the United States government, and so the player characters that decades ago, and the player characters help overthrow the tyrannical dictatorship of the Castigan regime. The Castigan regime was allied with, backed by the Carcosan forces, and so the players in the game, the Castigan regime has been overthrown about 6 months earlier, and the player characters are helping influence the reformation of the United States. They have friends who are part of forming the new government, and while they are also engaged in rooting out the Carcosan and Castigan holdouts, so basically the supernatural and the natural forces that were allied with the Carcosa before the, and so that's sort of the Aftermath setting. And then the final setting is This Is Normal Now. This is set in our present day America, in what we would call our reality. The player characters play ordinary people who realize that things aren't right. What they discover and they investigate is signs of Carcosan incursions into our current reality. So how do these all settings, how do we use these settings in the games? So you can use any of the four settings as a standalone one-shot of investigative weird fiction or horror. You might run a mini campaign focused in one of the four settings in which the player characters confront and try to stop the Carcosan incursion. Or you can play a massive time and reality spanning campaign covering all four settings in which the player characters confront and try to stop the Carcosan incursion. Of note, if you play this, the reality and time spanning option, the player characters in each setting are connected to each other. So the Wars and Aftermath characters are related to or have important objects from the Paris characters. So if you play this, the all four settings, the Paris characters either have the Wars and the Aftermath characters are either related to the Paris characters, or they have some sort of important object, or the Paris character as an artist is like their favorite artist and is very influential on them. In the This Is Normal Now setting, the player characters are the counterparts of the Aftermath characters. So basically, the conceit there is that in the This Is Normal Now, the player characters are baristas or Uber drivers or whatever, and they are what the player characters in the Aftermath setting would be were the Aftermath setting if everything had not gone to hell. So that's how all if you play this the major all four settings, the characters actually have connections to each other, which is also obviously can be useful for sort of play, connecting everything together. So the game comes in a set of 4 books. You can get it as PDFs right now. As of this recording, the game designer Robin Law has just announced. This is like January 3rd, 2023. Robin Law has announced just days ago that the second printing of the books, the game, is in the works. He doesn't know when the delivery date will be, but they're actually being printed. So if you like physical books, you can look for it. They'll be coming out in 2023, but you can get the PDFs. The game, and so each book describes how to make characters for that setting. Each book describes the specific rules for that setting. Each book provides sufficient details to run a game in that setting, and each book includes an adventure for the setting. The Paris book also includes, so there's Paris, the Wars, Aftermath, and this is Normal Now. The Paris book also includes the general quickshot gumshoe mechanics, and the This Is Normal Now book includes an excellent workshop, excellent section for the GMs on how to run and create Yellow King role-playing games. So, as I said, the Yellow King role-playing game uses the quick shock variant of the gumshoe mechanics, and so the quick shock variant was actually made for the Yellow King. The basic principle of gumshoe is quite simple. The focus of investigative role-playing games should be on players interpreting and following clues rather than struggling to get a clue through skill checks. And so if you've ever played investigative games, such as Call of Cthulhu, you know that if you fail a skill check, you won't get a clue. So they're like the Alexandrian blog. A lot of people say, well, the Alexandrian blog says just have every clue should be placed 3 places in the adventure. Of course, players can still fail all 3 skill checks and not get the clue. So of course, a good GM, a good keeper, or whatever the term is for the game master in that particular game, just knows that you have to sort of drop the clue in somewhere so the player character doesn't get it. And Gumshoe just basically says, don't go to the hassle. There's, what you have are core clues. Core clues are the clues that are necessary to solve a mystery. And so basically, if the player character with the necessary skill, investigative skill, is in the appropriate location, they will get the clue. And then as the GM, if the character with that particular skill, investigative ability is not there, you either then give hints to the other characters like, oh, um, you notice this and you think if so and so was there, they would understand it. Or you can invite a character to say, you've heard so and so talk about this, and so this is what you can interpret this. So there's basically, but the idea is if the core, if a character is there with the investigative ability, they get the core clue. They get all clues, though they're generally, but the core clues are the ones that are important to propel the mystery on, so the player characters can continue following the mystery and get to the conclusion of the adventure, the scenario. So Gumshoe and Quickshot Gumshoe abilities. Basically, in Gumshoe games, player characters have two kinds of abilities: investigative abilities and general abilities. The investigative abilities are how the player characters gather clues. If a player character with a requisite investigative ability is in the appropriate place, again, they will find the core clue. With Quickshot, they have what are called pushes. So each character gets 2 push points per scenario. If you're familiar with Gumshoe, your normal investigative abilities like assess honesty or bureaucracy or accounting, things like that, you have points to them. It's like, you're an expert if you have 1 point in it. You can go up to 5, generally, and then you can spend those points for bonuses. You don't need them to get a core clue, but you can spend them to get sort of mechanical bonuses. And Quickshot does away with the points, pool points for investigative abilities, and just gives each character 2 push points per scenario. And a push point is used with an investigative ability to gain an additional benefit beyond acquiring a clue. So you might use it to get someone who normally wouldn't grant you a favor. Like, so normally, let's say you try to do bribe someone, and the person is normally unbribable. That's actually in sort of the mechanics that you can't, they're not going to be able to bribe them. And this written scenario is written. Player can say, so can I spend a push to bribe them? And generally, unless there's a really, really, really good reason not to as a GM, the GM will likely, yes, that's because the mechanical benefit. Or a character might, let's say you actually need to, you're playing in the Paris setting, you're all artists, one of the characters is the poet, and you actually need to investigate a house. There's a party going on, and there's a bunch of people, but you need to sort of investigate rooms where you shouldn't be. And so the poet character can say, I'm going to spend a push and recite a poem that's going to enwrap just everyone, so that their characters can run off and investigate the house and not be noticed. So you can do something like that. With the pushes. General abilities. General abilities are how you do things when success and failure have consequences. So that's where you make skill checks. You don't use general abilities as investigative. You don't get clues from them. Generally, so you don't. I should actually say is you don't make general ability tests to get clues. Clues are always given. If there's a core clue, sometimes you can use a general ability. For instance, let's say you've got riding. It's one of the general abilities, the ability to ride horses in the Paris setting of the Yellow King. Maybe the players are investigating something, and the player with riding says, so tries to get information about horses. Say, hey, I know a lot about horses. I'm really good with riding. Can I tell something? Then the GM might decide that, yeah, they can use, in this instance, this general ability as an investigative ability, but they don't spend points for it, because general abilities do have points. We'll talk about, we'll give some examples of investigative abilities and general abilities and talk about how you use points for the general abilities in a little bit. Actually, it's the next slide here. So, general ability tests. In Gumshoe games, general ability tests are made by rolling a d6. And and all general abilities have a set of pull points to them, or actually it can be anywhere from, it can be 0, but anywhere from generally 0 to 8. And then, so a player can spend points to help with their roll, to add to the roll. So a die roll, so you roll the die, you spend pull points to beat a difficulty rating. The difficulty ratings can be anywhere from 2 to 8. Sometimes it can even be higher, but 8 is generally considered to be sort of like near impossible to be anyways. And the standard difficulty rating for is a 4. So you see, this is where you might want to spend some ability points. I've got an example here. Sophia and Claude need to gallop through a busy Paris street to warn their friend, who will die if they arrive too late. Sophia has a riding point pool of 6, while Claude has no riding point pool at all. the difficulty rating gets set at 4. So they need to beat 4 higher, or get 4 more on a D6 to be able to navigate through the busy Paris street to arrive to warn their friend in time. Sophia decides that she must make this ability test. So she's going to spend 3 of her 6 writing pool points, and that will guarantee her a minimum roll of 4. If she rolls a 1, she plus her 3 points, that's a 4. So if she spends 3 points, she will automatically pass the test. So Sophia rolls a 2, and she gets a total of 5. That's the 2 on the die roll plus the 3 points she spent. She is successful. Claude, on the other hand, has no points to spend at all. This doesn't mean he can't ride a horse. It just means that he's not very good at it. And so he rolls a d6, and he gets a 3. He rolls a 3, so that means he fails the difficulty, the test. And so while Claude and his horse are blocked by street traffic, Sophia expertly weaves her horse through the crowded street and arrives in time to warn their friend. So that's basically sort of a quick example of how tests work for general abilities. And so a little bit more about so Quick Shock. How Quick Shock, if you're familiar with Gumshoe, this is how Quick Shock differs from Gumshoe. Or if you learn, you start with Quick Shock, you'll find that other Gumshoes or games are going to be different. So some of the differences that Quick Shock introduces. Character creation is generally simplified in Quick Shock. So it uses what are called kits, and kits come with pre-assigned, and you must take a kit, and there can only be one person using a kit per game. That type of kit, and I'll talk about kits in a few minutes. In regular Gumshoe games, you might use Trail of Cthulhu has, I think it's professions, or an academic or a dilettante or something. Night's Black Agents has you can actually take up to 2, so that there's specialties, because basically your spies and criminal, you're actually, if you're not freelancers, but you were trained as spies or special forces or lived sort of like the criminal shadow underworld. So you might take a black bagger who specializes in breaking and entry, and or a weapons specialist, and you can actually, or a driver. You can take up to 2 of those, and that sort of gives you points. Or you can just make a character. So Quick Shock Gumshoe, you have these kits. And the difference, and so that makes kind of character creation easier. So like in the Paris setting, there's the sculptor, there's the landscape poet, or landscape artist, excuse me. There's the poet, etc. In Quick Shock Gumshoe, combat is player facing. So combat is also very simplified compared to a regular Gumshoe game. Basically, every player makes one single fighting test. So basically, and I'll go through and actually explain combat a little more in detail in just a minute. But so every character makes just one die roll. Every player makes one die roll, and then the GM tracks the overall margin of success or failure. So basically, there's a difficulty rating for your fighting test, and if you roll exactly if it's a difficulty 4, you roll a 4. You can spend points, your fighting points for it. That's a margin of 0, so the GM records 0. If you miss the test, if you roll a 2 and the difficulty is a 4, you have a margin of -2. If you roll 1, 2, or 3 above the difficulty, you can't go above 3. You can roll above 3, but you can't record above 3. You then have a margin of 1, 2, or 3 above that roll, and so then the GM adds up the margin overall. And if you get above 0 or above, you're successful in the combat. So then what also happens here in Quick Shock Gumshoe, what's different than regular Gumshoe games, is that they have cards. There's injury cards and shock cards. Injury cards represent physical injuries. Shock cards represent sort of emotional, psychic trauma. And player characters who fail composure tests can gain shock cards. So like if you realize, oh my gosh, vampires are real, that first time you realize that vampires are real, that can be a shock. And there's actually a shock card for sort of for making that realization. And so how do injury and shock cards work? Basically, so you have in Quick Shock Gumshoe, your characters have health, your character has composure, but those, and they're just like regular general abilities. You have a pull point in them. If they go down to 0, nothing happens to you other than you can't spend pull points on those rolls. How we track sort of like your physical injuries, whether your character is at risk of dying or sort of risk of going insane through shock cards, depends on whether you're playing horror mode or occult mode. In horror mode, which is you can take 3 injury cards or 3 shock cards. So it's like you can actually have 4 cards altogether. You can have 2 injury cards and 2 shock cards and still just be fine. But if you get a 3rd injury card or a 3rd shock card, those are called your final cards, and your character either dies or your character goes incurably insane, depending on whether it's injuries or shock that takes you out. In cult mode, it's 4 cards. And then cards themselves come in terms of minor cards and major cards, and they sort of represent basically the if you get a card, the worse your die roll is. Depends on whether it's a minor or major card. Minor cards generally can be discarded over time, or if you perform a specific action. And I'm going to give you some examples so you can see these cards in a second. Major cards can usually over time can be swapped out for a minor card, or actually can just be gotten rid of by performing an action. And then if you swap out for a minor card, then the minor card has the way you can get rid of the card altogether. So you can sort of lose cards. You can get rid of cards over time as well. So you can sort of you gain cards and lose cards, and that represents your character sort of taking damage, or sort of being traumatized by the horrors that you're encountering, and then over time you can get better, or you can get worse. So samples from the Paris setting, and oftentimes cards are sort of paired together because, as I said, not all cards are, but as I said, sometimes like there's the minor card represents sort of like the minor effect, the major card represents the major effect of something. So Claude is an injury card. As long as you're carrying the Claw card, you have -2 to all tests. So all general ability tests are -2. And if you have 2 injury cards, or if you're playing a cult mode and have 3 injury cards, you can have multiple cumulative penalties to what you do. But you can see if you can trade for on the mend if you have any physical success. So there's some of your general abilities, fighting, athletics, are considered physical abilities, and so if you make any successful roll on a physical ability, you get to get rid of the Claude card and switch it out for on the mend, and then on the mend has a much easier sort of mechanic to get rid of it. The major card is eviscerated. So eviscerated, you can see, actually is a really horrific thing. It actually counts as 2 cards while you're carrying it. So so it's basically, if you're playing a game, a horror game, and you get an eviscerated card, you're out with just 1 more injury, even though you only have 1 card. And you can see the mechanics here. You can't make a physical test. So you can't do any physical tests when you're carrying this card. After 6 hours of world time, so there's game time, world time is set in the game, you can trade on the mend as a recipient of a difficulty 6 first aid success. So if someone, after 6 hours of world time, someone and there's and this I'm not going to talk about the time increments in this tutorial, but basically, after 6 hours, if someone performs a difficulty 6 first aid test on you and they're successful, then you can swap out the eviscerated for on the mend. After 12 hours, you can see then that difficulty rating for the first aid test drops to 4. So that's some examples of injury cards. And then here's some examples of shock cards, again from the Paris setting. Cause for concern is the minor card. So basically, when any other player character in the game makes any kind of successful general ability test, you get to get rid of the card. So the idea is you're concerned, but their success sort of like, oh, okay, things aren't as bad as I thought. Then there's time to panic, which is the major card. You have -1 to focus tests. So there's a set of general abilities that are the focus under the kind of the focus category, and so you have a -1 to all your focus tests while you carry this card. And basically, while you carry this card, whenever another player character succeeds at any general ability test, you mark a tick. And if anyone makes a failure, you kind of scrap that. But if you get 3 ticks before someone gets a failure, so if there's basically any other player character gets 3 successes on a general ability test before anyone has a failure, you get to get rid of the time to panic card. So those are some examples of the mechanics. You might be able to hear my cat sort of moving around in the background here. So, character creation in Quickshot Gumshoe, as I said, uses kits. The kits, there's investigative kits and general kits, and you choose one of each for your character. And as I said, basically every player can only choose 1 kit. So there's 7 kits in each of the settings, and so you can have up to 7 players, or it might be 6. It's 7 or 6, depending, I think, on the setting, and so they determine the investigative kits determine your investigative abilities. The general kits determine your general abilities. So, and As a note for the general abilities, each general ability is going to be between 0 and 8, representing the pool points you have to spend for tests. The investigative kits reflects your character's profession, field of study, expertise, etc. So, an example of an investigative kit. In the Paris setting, one of the available investigative kits is the portrait painter. So the portrait painter gets the following investigative abilities. Assess honesty. It's an interpersonal ability. You can basically sort of tell if someone's lying. And fashion, you are knowledgeable about fashion and everything to do with fashion. Painting, you know about painting, and if there's any kind of clues connected to painting, whether it's in a painting or about the knowledge of painting and famous painters, symbolism used in painting, movements, then you get the clues. Photography, the portrait painter is also knows photography. Photography is fairly new, but there's actually the first sort of portable cameras are running around, and also your character as a portrait painter has a camera, and so you can look at photographs, you can the history of photography, stuff related to photography, and you can find clues based on that. And then society, so stuff about sort of French society, and sort of like who's upper class, lower class, what upper class people do, etc., things like that. And so you can get clues from there. General kits. So one of the available general kits in the Paris setting is the former med student. So the former med student has the following abilities with the ability ranks. Athletics 3, so they have a pool point of 3. So all these are all the general abilities that are available in the Paris setting. So there's athletics, there's composure, and you can see the med student has a high composure. Composure is basically your ability to keep your wits about you, your ability to keep calm under times of stress or when you're exposed to horrific things. And that's why you make composure tests. If you fail composure tests, you get shock cards. So a med student would be someone who's been exposed to stuff. So that's the idea there. Fighting, ability to fight. First aid, the ability to perform first aid. Health. So that's is sort of a rank of the character's physical health, but it's not hit points. That's one of the big things when you're playing Quickshot Gumshoe. Your health general ability has no direct connection to how much damage you can take. There are, when you might make a health check, you have pool points to spend. So if your health goes to 0, you no longer have pool points, but it's not a rank, it's not any determination of your hit points. You can be at health 0 and be in perfect health. You just don't have any more points to spend on health rolls. Mechanics. The med student doesn't know, just really doesn't understand mechanical objects. Can't fix them, can't jury rig them. Can't sort of if there's a tricky new mechanical device, you can't figure it out. Riding, the ability to ride a horse. Sense trouble. Sneaking covers everything from being able to slip into someplace unnoticed, the ability to pickpocket, the ability to pick locks, the ability to sort of palm something, things like that. And then preparedness. All Gumshoe games have preparedness. Preparedness is a really cool mechanic because Gumshoe basically sort of manages money and equipment, most equipment, in terms very abstractly. And so what you do, my favorite example of the use of preparedness actually is going to come from Night's Black Agents. It's actually a description by the in the rule book written about a play test. So basically, to be very brief, if you want something unusual, or if you're do we have this, and you don't have time to get it, you can make a preparedness roll and get it. So the example again from Night's Black Agents was that the player characters were rushing into a building to take out a bad guy who had some important documents, and one character, the sniper, their weapon specialist, was sitting on the roof of a building across the street, and they realize that they can't take the shot, and everyone's like, "We need to run in." And the player character, who's the sniper on the top of the roof, is just sitting there, and everyone's sort of trying to figure out why they're not running in to sort of help. The player characters get to the room, the person's gone, they run to the roof, and they see the person taken off in a helicopter. The player character who's the sniper says, "I knew this was going to happen. How much preparedness do I, what's the difficulty rating for me to have, for a preparedness check for me to have a Stinger missile in my weapons bag here at my feet?" The GM says, "That's going to be a 9. And the player character says, "I haven't used any of my preparedness. I have 8 points. I spend them all. I have a Stinger missile." And Night's Black Agents also has what's called a military operational specialty. Every session you get to use, it's tied to a general ability, and use an automatic success. And the player character, as the weapon specialist, is shooting. Had not spent their MOS that game as well. So the player character then said, now with the Stinger missile, said, "I use my MOS to take down the helicopter." They got to kill and the GM was expecting the bad guy to get away, and it didn't happen because that character was really smart and made a really excellent use of preparedness. So let's say you're playing the Paris game and you realize, oh my gosh, we need some dynamite to blow this thing up. Someone makes a preparedness roll to see if you have dynamite. Then if you succeed, you've got some dynamite. So that's how the skills work there, the general abilities. Creating characters, you also have drives. That's common to all Gumshoe games. And then what I'm calling weirdness, and I'll explain why I call it weirdness in just a second. It's my term. It's not the official term of the game. So drives are common to all Gumshoe games. A drive is what compels a player character to run towards danger. In most people confronted with supernatural horror and terrible things is not going to say, hey, let's go check this out. But you're going to run home. You're going to slam the door. You're going to hide and try to forget about it, or just fret and worry about this thing you've just discovered. But you're playing, the characters are protagonists in a horror game, and therefore they're supposed to run towards the horror. They're supposed to run towards the danger. And so your drive is what drives your character forward. And some of the drives for the Paris setting in the Yellow King are arrogance. So basically, it's like, common people would run away from this, or would let other people handle this. I'm not a common person, so I'm going to do this. Or curiosity. Or maybe you have a family curse. You just believe that the horrible things that are happening are connected to your family curse, and there's no escaping it. So might as well deal with it. Gothic sensibility. So, you're intrigued by the macabre, the horrific. Or maybe you're a showboater. You just like to one up other people, and thereby, doing these risky things. You're doing that. So you've got a drive. That's an explanation of why you're doing crazy things. And the GM can, if your characters are sort of like not doing something, they're sort of not moving towards danger because we want to protect our characters. The GM can say, hey, your drive, and remind you that you have a player about their drive, and might explain how that they're just itching to understand this mystery that's going on, and for a curiosity drive or something. So weirdness, what I'm calling weirdness, every player character starts with a specific weird or horrific experience or memory connected to the Carcosian incursion. So this is different for each setting. In the Paris setting, it's called Deuce Peculiar Business. And in the Aftermath setting, it's called Worst Memory. So it's like a worst memory of your encounters with the Carcosan forces as an insurgent. Deuce Peculiar Business is the weird thing that your characters noticed. That's you don't know at the beginning of the game. You don't know that it's been caused by this You don't know about the Carcosian incursion yet. And maybe if you're playing a one shot, the GM tells you but often if you're playing a campaign, you don't know until the beginning, but there's the weird thing. It could be a daydream. It could be something like maybe you open up your diary and it's under lock and key and someone else has written in it. Or you see a statue that you're pretty damn sure has changed position. Not just like, face a different way, but actually the arm, its head is moved or the arms are moved or it's posing differently. Things like that. Or maybe the gargoyles in Paris seem to be like watching you, or there's a person has gone missing that actually not just gone missing, someone that exists. Maybe it's your lover or your best friend is not only just gone, no one remembers them. Something like that, for the Paris setting. Also making characters relationships. Every player character these especially with the Paris setting, the different settings can be a little bit different. The player characters generally know each other at the start of the game, even if you're starting a campaign. But definitely, in a one shot. So they know each other, and each player chooses one other player character upon whom their character relies. So, and then everyone also then chooses a player character whom their character feels protective of. And so what you do is you go around the table, and everyone can only choose one person. So once someone relies on someone, no other player character can rely on them. What you do then, it creates this double network of connections between characters. Every character at the table in the game relies on one of the other player characters in the game, and every player character in the game feels protective of one of the other player characters in the game. And so this sort of gives the players and their characters some sort of immediate connection to each other, to sort of help role play, and also helps propel each other into danger. So combat, we're getting very close to the end here. There's just a couple more slides. So quick shot combat, again, differs from regular Gumshoe. It's more streamlined compared to standard Gumshoe games, as I noted. every player only makes one fighting roll, and that's it. So basically, at the start of combat, the group, as a group, defines their objective. So what is the objective you want from this combat? Your objective could be running away. It could be everything up to killing your adversary. Maybe you want to maybe you're trying to keep the adversary from entering a building or going down an alleyway. Maybe you need to capture one of them. Maybe you're fighting, you've got a bunch of hoodlums who are are some people who are ruffians who are connected to something trying to investigate, and you want to interrogate one of them. So you just want one of them. So maybe your objective is to grab one and run away. Or maybe they've got something that you need, so you just want to take what they've got and run away. Maybe you want to subdue them, but not kill them. So you define your objective as a group. And then every player describes what their character is doing to achieve that goal. And I'll note here that the action doesn't necessarily need to be an attack. And like the example combat that's used in the Yellow King role-playing game, and the mechanics again, the basic mechanics are described in the Paris setting, so it's using the Paris character, is that I think they're just trying to subdue a group, and so one character in the sample combat is described as just running into the crowd, into the fray, swinging an umbrella. They're not even trying to hit anyone. They're just trying to, basically distract, and the opponents have to actually sort of dodge the swinging umbrella. And so so you can have a character who doesn't really want to hurt anyone. Maybe you just want to scream, or maybe your character is trying to intimidate or distract while other people do what you're trying to do. Because again, fighting, you don't actually even necessarily need to hurt anyone. You just need to, maybe you just want to keep them from going somewhere. You just want to grab some object from them and get away. So you can describe whatever you do to achieve that goal, up to trying to kill someone, if your goal is to try to kill someone. So then there'll be a difficulty rating for the group you're fighting, for the adversary or adversaries, and so the GM will tell you what that is, and you need to make a fighting test. And you can spend your pull points from fighting to help bolster your roll. And again, what you do is you roll, and if you meet, or how you succeed, whether you meet if it's, let's say it's difficulty 4, you have to get a 4 or higher. Do you get a 4? Do you get a 3? Do you get a 6? If you fail to get a 4, if it's difficulty rating 4, if you fail to meet the difficulty rating, so if it's difficulty 4, that means you roll a 3, 2, or 1. You take a minor or major injury card, depending on how low it rolled. So if it's difficulty 4, you roll a 3, you take a minor card. If you roll a 2 or 1, you take a major card. And then you as a character narrate how you failed in your attack, or whatever your action is, because it's not necessarily a physical attack. If you meet or beat the difficulty rating, it's a success, and so then you narrate that success. And again, if you get, if it's difficulty 4 and you get a 4, then that's a success. If you get a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, depending on how many points you spend, that's a success. And then you also look at it as really powerful, dangerous adversaries have what's called a toll rating. So even if you get a success against a powerful adversary, you have to pay the toll to avoid getting an injury. And you pay the toll by spending pull points from fighting, athletics, or health. And so you can actually take from any of them. So you can combine them. So let's say the toll is 2, you can spend 1 of athletics and 1 of health, and you pay the toll and everything is fine. Or if you can't pay the toll, if you don't have any pull points to spend, or you don't want to spend pull points, you can take the minor injury card from that adversary. So again, in combat, with every die roll, the GM records the attack's margin compared to the difficulty rating. So if the fighting test fails, it results in a negative margin. So if it's difficulty 4, you roll a 2, you've got 2 minus 4 is -2, or 2 minus, it's your margin is too short, so it's -2. And if you roll, if you just meet it, so if you roll if it's difficulty 4, you get a 4, your margin is 0. If you roll if you roll over, the margin is going to be how many points over. So if it's difficulty 4 and you roll a 5, it's a margin of 1 point, a positive 1. If you roll a 6, it's a positive 2. If you roll a 7, it's a positive 3. And again, you can make these rolls but through the use of pull points. if and with the fighting test of the margins, if you rolled an 8 and it's difficulty 4, it's still recorded as a 3 because you can't have higher than a 3 for the margin in the recording of the margin. However, if you get over 3, so if you did roll an 8 on a difficulty 4, the GM notes that it was actually more than underlines in the recording, underlines the 3 to note that you actually rolled higher than a margin of 3. And at the end of the game, at the end of the combat, you get a benefit. You might get, I think it's an extra push. I have to go back and look at the rules, or I do know that the GM might say, hey, you get to refresh one of your your pull points. So like you spent a lot of athletics lately. You get to refresh your athletics pull point by X number of points, maybe even a full refresh. So then what the GM does is adds up all the margins. So for the entire group. And so if there's negative margins, those are count as negative points. If there's zeros, count as 0, and if there's positive numbers, the margins are positive. You add up the positive ones, and you get the cumulative total of the fight test, the margins of all the rolls. And if it's 0, if the cumulative total is 0 or higher, the player characters succeed. If the cumulative total is negative, they fail in their success. They can't be harmed any further. So it's not like if you're trying to fight for the death and you get it, and your cumulative margin is -2, and so it's just a really bad fight. Maybe it's a really powerful being, and you have to roll really high. There are difficulty levels of 8 for some of the really powerful opponents. So basically the idea is that you failed. However, you take the injury cards or the shock cards you get from the combat for failing, but you don't die just because the group failed. What happens is that the GM then figures out how your situation is worse. And maybe, depending on who it is, they might just sort of leave you battered and bruised. Maybe you're captured now and you have to escape. Whatever it is like that, if you fail. So here's an example of how combat is tracked, and then basically we're at the end of the presentation here. So you can see we've got the little chart, and so I'm just actually narrating across from. And so if you set up a chart like this for a GM, you may actually start with Noelle rather than Carrie, but we're going to just go from left to right with Carrie first. So Carrie, you can see there, there's the difficulty rating of 4 is the. No, actually, I guess it's yeah. So we're whatever. Didn't decide what the difficulty is for this example, but basically Carrie decided to spend 3 points. So Carrie rolls a d6, spending 3 fighting points, adds those 3 points to the die roll, and whatever this is, let's say that this is difficulty 4. Carrie rolled a 1, so the 3 points takes Carrie's roll to a 4, and that means that Carrie has a margin of 0 because Carrie just got the difficulty rating of 4. Noelle then rolls. Let's say that Noelle spends 1 point, difficulty rating of 4, and so basically with the die roll and the added pull point, Carrie still is too short. So Carrie's margin is -2. And at this point, after the second roll, the cumulative margin is -2. Saif then rolls. Saif spends 3 pull points. Saif rolled a 7. Yay! So Saif has so the margin is 3 because the difficulty was 4, so that's 3 above 7 is 4. 3 above 4 is 7, and so the GM now records it's like -2 plus 3 is +1. So the group is now in positive numbers. And it's all up to Anna. Anna spends 3 points. Anna gets a margin of 2, and that margin of 2 added to the 1 is a margin of 3, and the party is victorious in their endeavor, whether it's just to get away, to keep the opponent from trying to get into a building, to grabbing a prisoner the opponent's had and getting away safely with the hostage they're trying to save, or whatever it is, or actually killing or subduing or killing the adversary. So that's it for the presentation for this video. And thank you.